All right, welcome everybody to our final panel of the day, Exposure, which features Garnett Cadogan and James Enos in conversation with Mohsen Mostafavi and myself as moderators and potentially interlopers. I'm Annie, I'm a DDes candidate here. I'm an artist primarily working in experimental film, but also through public practice with James Enos in our platform Social Logistics. Mohsen is an architect and educator and serves as the Alexander and Victoria Wiley Professor of Design and Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor. He served as Dean of the GSD from 2008 to 2019. His work focuses on modes and processes of urbanization and on the interface between technology and aesthetics. Garnett Cadogan is the Tunny Lee Distinguished Lecturer in Urbanism at the School of Architecture and Planning at MIT. His research explores the promises and perils of urban life, the vitality and inequality of cities, and the challenges of pluralism. James Enos is an associate professor of art and the chair of Studio Core at the University of Georgia. His research engages issues of process, architecture, and social practice in an effort to understand how public culture responds to change. So I convened this group to think through what other modes of direct phenomenological methods of monitoring change, whether it be in social, climate, or even temporal systems. So what methods are made even more urgent in the context of the real-time remote turn? This panel sets out to discuss the enduring value of being in space despite the real-time simulation or remote sensing turn. Of particular interest is thinking of ourselves as subjects in a system and attending to calls to remain exposed, to rupture, encounter, loss, and change. In what ways does remote sensing and simulations of landscape, urban or otherwise, render these sites objects of study that exist solely out there, apart from us? If we can cue the slides. So one short note on the images that you'll see today behind us. The drawings, which are sort of first in the deck, are by James Enos. And they're sort of drawings of embodied patterns, part of a, just one way of many that James practices. But they're intrinsically tied to his work on situating oneself as a subject within a system as a way of entering larger questions of polycrisis and planetary urban critique. The maps that you will see eventually are from Nonstop Metropolis. They're from Garnett's research. He did the research on all of them by walking, of course in concert with various data techniques and technologies, but he shared with me in conversation that it was walking that opened up the questions and mainly wrestled with or resolved them. So I think we ought to begin this conversation with a pretty loose question about walking. Like I said earlier, monitoring change, whether in social, climate, and temporal systems, with remote sensing platforms and other similar technologies, are one way to figure modes of engagement, as we've seen demonstrated earlier today. However, a commonality in both of your work seems to be about direct exposure to the built and natural environment through ambulatory practice, exposure to rupture, to loss, and to encounter. Maybe one way we can begin is with a simple question about practice. First, what drew you to this way of working? How did you end up here? And were there any pivotal projects or experiences that calcified encounter, walking, connection, etc., as important methods?
James just said he wants to go first.
Okay. Arriving at a practice, I think, is tangled up in, maybe a longer understanding of how I got shaped by cities. Right? I grew up traveling, spending more time at the back of loading docks of buildings, thinking they were interesting to skateboard, or hanging out with friends, car to car, city to city, starting to realize that there were spaces I could enter and couldn't enter, and I was sort of told who I was and socialized by North American cities, which, if we know anything about North America, it is inherently regional, right? And so there you would be shaped by not only by the built environment, but shaped by the social processes or the places you could stay, and the type of things that would occur in that way. When I studied architecture, I became really interested in visualizing what I felt wasn't being talked about through the history of architecture. So this took the form of like experimental cartographies that I would go out and map and record and then think of like a visual environment as a type of surface skin that could be applied to a mass, like a point in time, like the index of light would then be frozen in time upon some sort of mass, and that those would be heuristic objects. They would tell you something. And it didn't really work to the extent where folks would start to think, more or less, that like, maybe that's an art object, right? Or maybe that's now an artifact in and of itself, right? So that led towards being with others and being out and trying to think of more participatory models that ultimately became about building the social viability of a program, and that the building would exist to house a program once you formed the purpose of an institution. So those institutions that I worked on, largely museum programs, public urban arts initiatives, became about being out in the city with people to kind of do that foundational thing that I did in the beginning, which was, being stranded in Dallas or something, or sleeping on a roof in Albuquerque, or trying to figure out how you get back and spending time with others, and realizing you have a totally different relationship to space during that time. And it's not just one of the flaneur or something like this, right? It is one of negotiating infrastructure and negotiating the way services are provided and the way people behave in these systems regionally. So pedagogically, that became a turn for me, is that something happens when you're out with people, right? And it's not just about looking at necessarily, as much as beginning to sympathize with and be changed by those spaces, right? So I think that that's a central, if walking is a methodology, or drawing is a form of walking or a form of recording, a form of movement that can be revisited, like writing is a form of walking, right? Or something like that, a path. Then for me, very much, that's about, having that path be changed and shaped by others, being porous to something that can happen and being out and meeting others.
There's some strong overlaps between the way I came to walking and think of walking as a methodology and you. That it's growing up in Kingston, Jamaica. It's a very public culture. It's in a place in which so much life is lived in big, vivid, sometimes too vivid ways on the streets. And so it also meant negotiating these different spaces. It meant recognizing when you're in a particular neighborhoods in which there sometimes could be an inverse relationship by the levels of entertainment our joy, but also levels of danger. So you recognize, for example, which may make no sense to Americans, but in Jamaica, in the neighborhood, and you're hearing a little bit too much Celine Dion. Celine Dion is the patron saint of gangsters back home. Here it's sappy music, but back home the gangsters love Celine Dion. So you start thinking of ways of negotiating the way you relate to the urban space because of that. And so to then think in that space was to think not only visually, but your full sensory armory, sound, smell, sight, feel. And so from very early I began thinking about what it meant to think about my relationship to space, but in the full sensory armory. And there's nowhere new in which I could negotiate, think about, reflect on, immerse myself in that as much as walking. And so as I began entering and thinking about architecture and urbanism and urban spaces much later on through writing, which for me writing is not presentation. It's a way of figuring things out. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of having a rich engagement with others. It's a way of sort of turning back questions on yourself that I found that, again, the richest writing, was writing that was actually asking you to think through, the full sensory richness, which then drove me back again to walking because of the beauty of encounter, but not merely the beauty of encounter, how encounter allows ways of observation, of investigation, of analysis, but more than anything else, how walking allows you to immerse yourself in a place and inscribe yourself onto that place, but also open up your imagination and have it inscribe itself onto you. And so that mutual inscribing that's happening, in which you're making a mark in place, but the place is also making a mark on you. And so walking became a skeleton key of sorts in how I negotiated the built environment.
So thank you both so much for this. Earlier today, I was in Harvard Square walking, and I saw a colleague of mine who was also walking, and he had his iPhone in his hand, and he was looking at the iPhone, and then he looked at me, and he was in a completely kind of bewildered state. Actually, it's kind of shaken me, but he was listening to news from Lebanon while walking, and I think in the context of some of these discussions, the relationship between things that are very far and things that are very close, like encountering a friend in Harvard Square, but actually the thing that is on his mind and is completely kind of affecting him is the news from somewhere very far away. And in a way, I think in the context of academic institutions, this idea of things that are not close, earlier there was the discussion of representation, but also things that are very immediate and very, very direct. I think it's quite an interesting thing. Because I heard you were going to talk about walking, of course, it's sort of, because I walk, not necessarily for the same reason, but I'm sure there's always this kind of connection to what you observe. But also because I then started to think, how I remember walking in some ways. And I'm part of a generation of students, when I was a student, that the work of people like Richard Long, the sculptor, and Hamish Fulton. I don't know if you're familiar with these artists, but Richard Long did in the 1960s, and I discovered these things much later, but in the 1960s he did a series of very important projects that are to do with the marks that walking makes. And so the relationship between walking and then the marking and then the photography of those. So it also seems like a very interesting situation to be reminded of the different ways in which walking can actually be part of a kind of conceptual project today. And in the school, I feel, and this would be very interesting to ask both of you what you think about this. I think the question of walking and the kind of encounters that James mentioned before, it's about being outside. It's being outside of the academy. The academy is always sort of a very protected environment, and it's always dealing with these representations of things that are out there. So finding these experiences which actually enable you to encounter things directly, I wonder how you utilize that in terms of your pedagogy or in terms of your experiences also within the context of the institution. But maybe that's something for now or for later, if you...
Okay, I'll jump in. Well, one of the beauties or one of the possibilities that walking opens up is for us to think about our relationship to standardization. So we've been discussing measurement throughout the day and thinking about what it means to think of measurement. We use whether it's imperial measurement or the metric system, which everybody in the world except 3 countries, the US, Libya, and Myanmar, uses. It becomes this common language with which we can have a discussion with each other. That if you say, "Oh, this is 7 meters," and what 7 meters is like running 100 meters, 6 liters. And so we get so accustomed to standardization, and standardization is a way in which we have this common language, within the academy, but other places we think of as inside. And so to be outside and to begin to ask, how do people make marks? How do we, as it were, depart from standardization? How do we use the body as a way of measurement? So, how do we think of it even like, say, an early metrology, where, for example, a cubit was from hair to hair, or in a arm span, or in some places is how long a deer walked before it needed to pee. Turns out it's like around 6 miles. And so in being outside, it allows me to see, how the ways in which people, make their distinctive in marks and things. And so in design, we're often trying to think about patterns, that we're in the business of pattern recognition. But along with the pattern recognition, we're also trying to find out, how do we make ways in which we're inimitable? What's my voice? What's your voice? What is, as it were, style, voice? And to find the standard, but in the midst of the standard, to also find the distinctiveness. And so to be outside in that, in a close encounter, to, not merely observe, but even to actually observe ourselves observing, to, not merely, even, really thinking about close attentiveness, but to, have immersion where, we've given ourselves over to a place and lose that kind of control, which many times we focus on in the academy. So, I don't know, it sometimes can be like being in a car. I want to hear Taylor Swift in this particular volume, 70 degrees, potpourri, that control. But if you're walking, you said, okay, I'm going to be hearing somebody blasting Journey's Worst song in a top volume, with the smell assaulting me and the heat. And so you've lost so much more control. But in losing that control, one then is given over to anything from serendipity to frustration, which invites in a whole rich and wonderful ways of observing, of letting us see the departure from the standard, and then open up questions that we might otherwise not have known to ask. Or I think that I think places raise questions many times that they can't answer. So there are all these questions that I had about cities that was raised when I was living in Kingston. But it's when I was walking in New Orleans, or say walking in Los Angeles, or walking in Berlin, that I suddenly went, aha, here's a question being answered. That cities sometimes have a way of answering questions raised in other cities. But that's something that's not seen except at that rich, close range, in the midst of encounter, in the midst of being outside, in a context of getting away from, as it were, standardization and finding other ways of, seeing how marks are made.
Do you have a method?
I have a method, and I also have an anti-method, if that makes sense. So I do have a method, one way which is, first to begin to, students or friends who know I like mentioning this meme, and I think I've mentioned it here before, that meme from a couple years ago where they showed the grid of New York City. And it said, New York City, and you see the grid, because we want you to get where you're going. And goes Boston, and all the serpentine highways, cul-de-sacs, dead ends, because forget you, there's a stronger word than forget. So you know what the word is. And so what it really is a New Yorker's idea of how Boston is responding to them, that you see the place as resisting you. And so in other words, you enter with a map, as it were, sorted to the imagination, that is actually finding a resistance with others. So one of my first methods is to say, let me start walking to see what map is sorted. What are the ways in which I see this place saying, forget you. And so it can, as it were, I walk through first and imagine that something is hovering over me, watching myself watch, watching myself watch, as it were, and getting my first impressions. In other words, what is new to me, or what is surprising, or what kind of assumptions, caricatures, inhibitions, enthusiasms I'm carrying. And to actually have that first, as it were, we like to talk about palimpsest, but we're often thinking about palimpsest embedded in the land where we are. But I also think that we carry palimpsests within ourselves, ways in which we have, habits, sensibilities, ways of being, inscribed onto ourselves or soldered to our imagination, and that actually are, layering over the places we encounter. So I walk first to try to, as it were, pluck apart the palimpsests that I actually have within me, and then to begin to ask, how then do I relate with things? How do I then move through, and I actually then move through with close attention to different sensory, aspects of myself. I'm moving through with sight in the same space, with sound, with smell, with feel, with taste, and then begin notating that. And then the anti-method is that, okay, I'm just going to start having something just, put me, where's my curiosity, where's my attention going, or trying to do what the poet Wisława Szymborska says, or she says, the urgent questions are the naive questions. I keep moving and said, what naive questions are coming to me, or what naive questions am I asking, hearing people ask, and how can I move in the trajectory of those naive questions? So I still have other layers, but in many ways, that's the one thing that holds constant from place to place, and especially my first time entering.
I don't know if it's a interstitial space that this thought will form, or if it will, sort of connect with the idea and the reality of confronting your friend. But it makes me think that, walking or something like this, being out, isn't beholden to a set of marks or an idea. There are many ways to think about personal topology, like myself as a body or identity object in space, making a mark, some form of minute surface transformation, being a sensory system, myself as a personal topological surface transformation based on my psychology and my diet and my other biorhythms, right? And then confronting that object in space and thinking that that object is also producing its own type of record, right? And that record could be a series of correspondences, open conversations. It could be, it could take a visual form, but the assumption is that being out and at least engaging, an active process of defamiliarization or, trained, what we do with art, teaching in an art school is so much of it is about seeing and looking and providing a space for introspection to occur and to create an internal feedback loop with yourself, to have a dialogue, to make these sort of acceptances and rehearsals at the same time, right? That people are drawn to or toward embodied experiences that, and I'll clean this up really quickly by offering a project line, is like if I go and try to engage the salt route in Germany and I take what research I can do for it in text or images that are available to me, it's going to do about the same for you as if you research the word globalization and it turns up an image search of shipping containers. Like, it's such an incomplete record to begin to engage what being in a space or along an itinerary can do. So the set of representations you may go to rely upon or be governed by or accept, it seems like such an incomplete thing before entering some sort of personal topological transformation or surface engagement at very least with processes of verification in the slightest, no matter the degree, I feel, of what you feel like, how far common sense may get you, right? But there's a series of ways that just can be broadening, I feel, by just like, not taking things for granted, right? And if approaching others in space the same way. That to me seems like a type of long-form site analysis or contextual analysis or soft ethnographic process, right? Of recording story and being with others. And it's a spatial practice.
One thing I want to say about going into it is that I think I might leave the impression that I have this, very richly, objective, almost, scientific, that it's a kind of, metrology. But I lean into the subjectivity. And one of the places in which I did is I go first, I'm always after the single story. What single story do I have about this place? When I land to Cambridge, like, what's the single story? Single story might be a caricature, but it might also be true. The danger of the single story is not, even whether it's true or false, it's that it then blinds you to other stories. It becomes the narrative, and this fills up the room in a far too much. So I walk in and say, what's the single story I have here? And do I lean into it? Do I try to discover more and more about it? And then, because it also becomes a basis, that's something I can talk about with the people I encounter, to say, this is my impression of Cambridge, or this is what I understand Cambridge to be. And they're like, oh, that's rubbish. Like, you too? And then it becomes a basis in which I can, give myself over to others, to be corrected, to make shifts, or for them to say, oh yeah, this is true, this really is us, but there is also, and then it creates that expansion. So I often go first, lean into this in a single story, knowing that it can be a basis, of conversation, of encounter, in which, I can be, corrected. It opens up to illumination, it opens up to laughter, it opens up to, in any number of ways. But I also, think about the chasms, like the places in which I don't connect. So in other words, I'm not only thinking about observing, I'm always thinking about how am I being observed? What are the places ways in which this place resists me, the forget yous? So what are the places in which, say, for example, like being black, I'm calibrating myself, not to my fear, but I'm calibrating to myself, to my anticipated, to the way I anticipate other people are fearing me. And so how then do I deal with those gaps, or in some case chasms? And so what it means then to think of this place as questions about belonging, home, alienation, movement, and so to measure place by the emotions, to measure place by affect. Where do I feel disgust? Where do I feel fear? Where do I feel joy, awe? That all become an important way of measuring the quality and in other words, to get what's the weight of a line, which is one thing that Richard Long is asking by seeing the marks. But I ask that literally, metaphorically. What's the weight of a line? Where does the line get broken when I'm moving through this place?
Yeah, I was just going to say that something that feels like it keeps coming up are questions of measurement and verification and the single story, or upending that. And I think it quite relates to some of the things that we've been talking about all day. James, I don't know how much you want to get into this, but we've had a bunch of recent conversations about the sea and shipping and the invention of the horizon and the wave field in the context of oceanography. It's something like an observable slice of time that can then be modeled, counted upon, and repeated. But I think we're trying to get at a different type of verification here. I don't know exactly how to phrase that, but something that goes beyond trying to ground truth, whether or not the single story holds or not. I don't know if that's cogent.
Just to kind of maybe a little bit to build on that, I notice a slight difference in a way in terms of the approach, and it could be that it's just my misreading. It seems, Garnet, you are very interested in the notion of narration of a story. I'm looking for a single thing, because that single thing, the singularity, is somehow a form of narration. And then that narration, that story, what is this about, what is this, is then a way of engaging with others. So that's like a mechanism. Whereas if I understood it correctly, James, and I think it would be interesting to find out whether you have any comments to make about the difference in terms of your education, going through architecture school and then being an artist, or going to art school. But it seems that you are walking or out there to look for a certain set of relationships, more than the single story, more than something that encapsulates through narration. Is that kind of fair or unfair?
Yeah, I think it's helpful. Thank you. One way to connect that to what Annie's suggesting, and I really like the work of Stefan Helmrich, who's at MIT as well, and he goes through a long, similar history of analysis of modeling waves, and it's kind of like an anthropology of oceanography, more or less. I don't know if folks are familiar with it, but it gets to this point where the way that, from the early onset of bathymetry and processes of figuring out calculations to land in stable seas for military purposes, this moves on to a set of abstractions that are representations much like we're looking at today, that then become taken seriously as models of predictability of what's coming, right? And it tells you something about all of us when we're modeling what's coming, and then within some interval of confidence, like with a degree of predictability, we're trying to gauge how to position ourselves in an abstract representation from a model of a future instantiation of something that in a wave field, for example, or myself being out walking, if I'm doing an analog version of this as a emotive capture, maybe, I don't know, is a slice of a very fluid, complex, maybe only dimensioned by surface and moderate depth. It's just like it's such a fine point to begin some scalar set of relationships that could cascade into something. So there's a hubris in that pursuit, right? And at the base of that knowledge, like, kind of a gridded knowledge, yielding sort of a gridded level, a point of control or something like that, or a set of ways that we will, orient ourselves towards for safety or for progress or for whatever else, seems like, it seems like, I don't want to call it a single story, but it seems like a short version of something where that in engaging in that field or being out, if it's looking for anything, I think it's looking for the porosity of being slow change, right? So if it's anything, you could say from maybe it's a little insular or a little navel gazing at times, right? It's not serving or engaging a citizenry as much as it may exist as an artifact that can be read or traveled visually or provide some other relationship to. But as the maker or the walker or the beer outer or the drawer or the organizer, like it's asking for that, to like track that slow change as a form of like, it's a moderate, like a shift in thought is like a moderate shift in technique. It's a long-standing, slow, everybody in this room could like flip 4 paradigm shifts that were central to them in their studies or in their life, pivotal life moments, right? But the space in between those is like a slow study, and that, conflated with many other things, is like this, the weight of personhood or something like that. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think of like the ocean system or the ocean engine or the production of land and the production of the atmosphere and the mineral distribution of all these things. And then for us as designers and planners or whatever, to look at the social geography of the ocean and draw a few lines on it and like put it in a socio-technical framework just seems at a point like a really kind of bracketed way of knowing. And what we know from Heidi Salavari or some of these folks is like knowing is akin, next step, to a point of certainty. Point of certainty is akin to a type of enforcement of a certain violence or a knowing of what others should not do or how others should not be. And so, if there's an art side, it's about like resisting the foreclosure of possibility, right? I don't know if that's helpful, but I'm sort of digging around there.
Yeah. I was going to say, in my case, the encounters are more important than narration, more important than anything else. But I'm trying to walk in a way that is not just drowning in my subjectivity to say, he took a walk, it was interesting. What does it say beyond, his own enjoyment or his own self-regard? And so I'm often trying to think about the context, like, in other words, to think of the walker, as, the reader's advocate, to think of the walker as the citizens, the neighborhoods, advocate. And so, therefore, how can I be asking questions that I'm deeply interested in myself, Garnet, but how can I also be asking questions as a kind of stand-in? What are the kind of questions you would want to know, going through here? What are the kind of questions that you may not ask but you'd ask then. And so I'm, seeing myself, moving through in an advocate, but I'm also trying to, navigate through in the context, thinking of what I often think is the three things, that I most have to be alert to as I'm thinking about the subjectivity. In other words, our tendency to, abstraction and, the things that get lost with the aggregates. I'm often thinking of abstraction and the aggregate, because in both, they have a way of flattening things, things get lost. And so the beauty of walking is to take in these different interstitial spaces, which is why I'm so focused on narration, because narration also, many times will do that. It will abstract things, or narration will sort of focus on the aggregate. It's, in its focus on form or in structure. It has to find ways to make things fit. And so things get squeezed out in the service of voice, in the service of point of view. So I'm often asking, how can I, to think of the walk as a kind of representation, that I can be focused on rich particularity, but that particularity doesn't get lost in the subjectivity. It has something to say. It's still very particular. My own taste, my own judgments, my own passions, my own quirks, but at the same time you feel that in some ways I've been a stand-in for you. I'm asking the kind of questions you'd have wanted to ask here, or the questions that you wouldn't ask, but you're happy to ask it because your better self would have wanted to ask that question. And so it's always trying to navigate between the particularity, as it were, the story, and the abstract and the aggregate, the situation, or to use Vivian Gornick's terms, the situation and the story, the larger context. But in other words, as I'm walking through, the walk is, as it were, a kind of argument that shows people living through the consequences, of their decisions. And so how then to think of it as a methodology is to not think of it as, oh, here I'm doing just as, say, Guy Debord is doing, where you're like, oh, that's interesting to him, but how would this be useful to a designer or to a planner? But to then walk in with questions about narration, about the abstract, about the aggregate, about the the walker as an advocate, as a stand-in, allows, I think, rich possibilities in terms of observation, explanation, analysis, reflection, that then could produce, say, in a map, or raise questions about maps that are then useful to the planner, to the designer.
No, I think that's really wonderful and very helpful. And I feel like I'm constantly describing my practice in the field as imagining myself as a chalk outline, right, of somebody interested in the granularity and the particularity, but just being evidence of any one person sort of witnessing these scales or these legacies. And I think when we maybe to talk about scale or legacy or other types of modalities and relationships and storylines, what are those that interest you that tend to get left out of perhaps the larger or more totalizing view that you can bring into focus through this way of practice?
There are people here who studied with me who will, I keep harping on this, and it's neighborhood. That's so often, I think we have fuzzy ideas about what neighborhoods are, and we almost use it interchangeably in a neighborhood, district, communities, if they're one and the same, and they're many times quite different, or there overlaps. And so one of the things that I'm I think gets left out is neighborhood as an idea. It's not just a geographic. Like people have ideas like, oh, that place is dangerous, or that place is exciting, or it's boring, or it's home, or it's alienating, and what it means actually. Think about it and wrestle with it as we're thinking through what are the kind of demographic realities. So there are issues around public health, housing, poverty, environmental concerns. And we've often focused on it and just have that mapped within a certain geography, but not asked, what's the idea of this neighborhood? And I think, if I'm Robert Simpson, who's just across the road there in sociology, and his discussion of neighborhood effects, that neighborhood lives just as much in us as we live in neighborhoods. And so even after we've long left neighborhoods, neighborhoods are still very much alive in us. We carry neighborhoods with us. But I think we sometimes have a tendency to sort of immediately run to sight, or we've actually either maybe focused too narrowly or too broadly, and so we either say site or community rather than a strong focus on neighborhood, and said, where exactly are the edges of these neighborhoods? Where do they blur? What are the ways in which sometimes one particular neighborhood may contain 4 or 5 different neighborhoods, and those mini neighborhoods are neighborhoods less by geography but by the different ideas that people have. And so I think one of the things I think often gets lifted up the conversation I'm often looking for as I'm walking is to say, what are the ideas of neighborhood that are alive here? What are the notions of neighborhood? What is neighborhood? Not merely as a geographical reality, but neighborhood as an idea, as ways of imagining in a social or cultural, in a boundaries. And I'm walking to begin to ask where those edges, where the interstitial spaces, where the overlaps, where do people consider themselves neighbors and strangers? And it's because of notions of neighborhood, less than any other notions or markers that we often use. And so the ideas of neighborhood, I think, often blurs or messes with our different, measurements or the ways we think of measurements, and actually have, ought to make us sort of, not, ought to make us, revise or, rethink just, how we measure, or actually not necessarily rethink as much as, add more layers, and open possibility for richer ways of analysis and viewing and design. So in walking, I'm often asking, what is the neighborhood? How do people define the neighborhood? What is the geography of the neighborhood? But what especially fundamentally is the idea of neighborhood? And how does understanding this, give me, ways of insight or encounter that allows a richer experience here, but also a richer understanding, not merely for my sake, but for the sake of the people who I'm having encounters with.
Yeah, I mean, I think a little bit of a jump in scale, having lived in a bunch of different places, as many folks on the path do. Terms like neighborhood or community, or certain ones that are containers, one, like in this instance, neighborhood very much around here, or being, as a pedagogical instrument, or being able to enter, being able to understand this idea, or what makes a neighborhood, how do you make a neighborhood? I've thought about this way in terms of versions of community, whether they be professional or intentional or otherwise. And having moved and been a part of rich neighborhoods or rich artist networks or design networks at moments in my life, like, it's been really important to try to scale into an understanding of networks and building and strengthening community and networks. So like the Port Journeys Project or Hypercultural Passengers, or some of those, 10 to 15 year long projects are really about like, okay, there's a form of visualization to say like, we're all spread out, but we can try to identify ourselves or speak about certain issues through forms of correspondence, and then travel and or be or host or circulate networks and grow versions of this politics or system of thought or sets of empathy or however it works. So I think that like I would agree wholly that this as something that you reframe something that has an entrance or an exit to something that you participate in the construction of, right? And I think that that's like the shift, or that is even what I would say is the programmatic shift in architecture in the early aughts, like the debate to equitably consider the program or the function or the actual institution before praising the building it's in, And I think that that's a really interesting thing to think. That in terms of some of these other conversations, is that, are these networks existing in the defense of the poor image, or are they post-internet objects, or what are they to be so decentralized physically, but be bound to sets of ideas or folks you study with, and try to draw those lines. Earlier speaking to folks at a middle school and then running up to a panel, and like how do you move these sets of ideas and as a form of goodwill between people and participate in growing those networks, right? Like what's actually being circulated at the end of the day from some of our work or ideas, other than the hosting of others and the growth of some of these correspondences, I figure. So I'd like to think of neighborhoods I've been attached to the same way I'd like to think about the way I participate in community or network, right? And those are, a set of interfaces, or participatory interfaces.
As you say that, I won't elaborate on this too, but it struck me that one thing that I wanted us to think differently about is neighborhood, spatially. But a next thing I think is overlooked is what I think is the real danger of how much we speak of our value, empathy, which I think as a concept does way more harm than help. And if I could discard it the way, I thought of that in an earlier discussion with resilience, which is something that's also is not necessarily helpful, that it often focuses on people in unhelpful ways at the expense of the circumstances or the structures, unjust structures that have to be working within or against. And so that's the next thing I think is overlooked, just how awful the idea of empathy is. So I know you all think I'm a sociopath, but...
Can you briefly elaborate for anybody who missed your lecture here in the spring, what you mean by discarding empathy?
Let's not discard empathy. There's this focus on that our real responsibility is to close the gap, is to be in someone else's shoes.
No way.
And I think what it does then, it makes too often that the goal is to emote. I feel bad, the work is done. Or I feel guilty, that the work is done. That the real work is to feel guilt. And we've made progress, that we've all sat down, we've all felt bad together. That's somewhat of a caricature, but what it doesn't do, and I think, is that by virtue of existing in a life, human life, non-human life, makes claims on us. I don't have to like you to have obligations to you. Yeah. That you've been here, all of you, have made claims on me, and I think often the empathy conversation moves it away from that and thinking about claims and thinking about obligations, and it's Nicholas has complicated the waters with that, but also responsibilities, and just think what are my responsibilities to you? What are my obligations to you? What claims do you have on me? And that language, or in other words, in those important questions don't get asked or worked out enough, because we're often thinking we need to close the gap. And actually, one of the things I sometimes do in walking, or I think walking is valuable, it shows these chasms, or the space between us that are hard to close. And so you don't then think, oh, this is what we need to do. Think empathy. It means to think about being in someone else's shoes or closing the gap. That sometimes the real point is to show the chasms that can't necessarily be closed in acts. In light of that, what do we then do? What are then our obligations, or what are claims that people are making upon us that we haven't figured out actually how to pass or to close those gaps? But it then puts before us real urgent issues that we have to think about. And not only urgencies, in a wonder, there's this, and Sarah Hendren says it all the time, the dangers of focusing on urgency at the expense of wonder. So people suddenly become the sum total of their tragedies, which often happen to be focused on empathy rather than to ask questions about claims, obligations, responsibility.
One quick thing. I spend a little bit of my time working on issues related to Japan and Japanese urbanization. And one thing that I learned a couple of years ago is that the word neighborhood doesn't exist in Japanese. And so part of the challenge was actually to try and get somebody to write about the complications of the word not existing. And with it, because you assume, and I would describe things in terms of neighborhood. For all intents and purposes, they look like neighborhoods. But with it, also the concept of neighborliness, the word doesn't exist in the same way that the relationship to neighbor and neighborliness. So that's an interesting thing, that you are focusing on conditions that also suggests certain forms of relationality between the people who are kind of participating or sharing. But I wanted to ask, because I haven't been able to see many of these big images, and of course this format lends itself to you speaking, and I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the relationship between an act and the outcome in some way. And I think this is also very relevant in a way within the context of the academy. So how do you, I can understand it when you explain, I walk and that's what it does, and it's a form of narration, or I encounter. But then you also produce something in the same way that the photograph of the artist who walks is the documentation of that experience after the fact. What's the relationship for you between the map, for example, and the walk, or the kind of experience and a piece of your artistic practice? Can you speak about that? What is the correlation between an action and the thing that in some ways is the outcome of that?
So like, for example, these are story maps versus the grid map. And where the grid map has a focus, it can locate anything within an abstract space. But the story maps are, have a particular, as it were, narration or focus on particularity. This one is the one that made people question my sanity. So I walked for, well, it's one of the things that made people question my sanity. But I walked 24 hours straight in New York City in all 5 boroughs, something which I've done every year since I did this map, because it was so much fun and so revealing. And just to let you know, people are always invited every year. I choose a different season every year. I begin, there's always like 20, 30 people, and by hour 4, it's just me and one other person. By hour 6 or 7, it's just me alone. So everybody comes over and says, we're doing it. And by 4 hours, everybody falls off and said, next year. but what it was, again, it started again with different stories of what it means to think of immigrant New York. What is immigrant New York like? And so a lot of them begin with this heavy research, often sociological, but also looking through earlier maps and grid maps to say what stories are being told here. And then to begin walking, with constant encounters, and to actually have that challenge and to ask, how can not only the nature of the walk, but then begin to shape the story maps? It's thinking. So like this, for example, you walk around New York City, and what public space tells you is that women have done nothing to contribute to the city. That every statue, every monument, every square, it's a man. And then when there's a woman, you're like, oh, great, here's a monument to a woman. Virtue, purity, peace. So she doesn't even have a name. And so what this was walking and interviewing people in a number of neighborhoods, and just researching neighborhood by neighborhood, and said, what's the most iconic map that people have of New York City? The subway map. And so what we did was then, every single subway stop, I walked around, interviewed people, not merely to say, who had lived here, but who still has that rich resonance of people who are living in that neighborhood. And so all those stops are the names of women who have lived in that neighborhood, and who also has, a rich cultural, intellectual, political resonance for the residents who are there. And so that just came from this constant walking, and sometimes it's just walking through and say, oh, they're still playing out a lot of Ella Fitzgerald here. Oh, she's still resonating. Oh, wow, I guess, Jenny is still like from the Bronx. Like, I'm still hearing from the neighborhood that she used to be, and they're playing. And so, or there's one there, if you flip a little bit more, right here. It was, constantly when people spoke of the contribution of people of Asian descent in New York City, it was often in apolitical ways. It was, you go to Chinatown to eat, and it's like, so is that the story of people of Asian descent? Is that the story of Chinese in New York? Just there to serve you? And so along with reading quite a bit on the history of Chinese and American in New York, I went to all the Chinatowns, did extensive interviews, but then I started walking all over and interviewing other people. What do you think of Chinese in New York City? And I recognized that there is this among people within the community, there was this frustration with the model minority myth, that the math, they're good at math, that is it. And so I began finding ways to say, what are the different rich cultural contributions, but also there's this rich culture of mutual aid that was happening there, that had had huge planning effects on the way the city dealt with elderly care, the way the city dealt with issues of loneliness and estrangement. And so all of those were there mapped on the map. But then there's also the Wu-Tang Clan, who then got the chance to interview some of them. I spoke to Ghostface Killer, for the people who are Ghostface Killer fans here. I spoke to Reza, and they spoke about just the significance, the cultural significance of Chinese and Chinese American living in Staten Island. And so suddenly the map then becomes a way of speaking differently of the presence, the role, the character, the contributions of Chinese in New York. And that gets away from the model minority myth, but also speaks of them as making incredibly rich cultural contributions, and not just intellectual contributions, as of them making rich political contributions, and then also having really wonderful individual particular story and the different allusions. So the colors, the numbers, so there are different things happening with the number 8. There are different things happening with red or in gold, and so the map is then layered from all those encounters and stories and multiple interviews and trajectories I've made.
Wonderful. If I can just briefly interject before handing it over to James and then opening it up to your questions. Something about these maps that reminds me of ambulatory practice or walking as artistic practice is that it's not a catalog of supposedly authentic facts documented, documents of being in space. But rather it's this catalog of asserting the possibility of being in space and finding what possibilities might remain or what resonances are still there. James, anything to add about the drawings?
Not really. I think thinking back of a long frame of work, the output is programs, the output is exhibitions, the output is looks like a lot of easy Claire Bishop critique, right? A lot of photos of people at picnic tables doing things together, right? Making things together. And then, in some instances, large public works like the MQ-1 Predator Reaper case staged throughout defense contractors in Southern California, mistaken as us, as if we were stealing a drone at General Atomics and chased out, like public intervention projects. There are, kind of things like that. The drawing practice itself is very much a movement to a background state. I had one of my great mentors in architecture, a person I really care for, Len Zagarsky, would talk about the role of background building. He studied with Moore, of all people. This seemed strange enough. But just like it really resonated with me that if all of this energy or design energy was put into something, a sufficient background, like a functioning, working, practical cause or something like that. And so a lot of those things became about pulling, slowly seeing how to pull a surface along and exist as a background state. I'm interested in that. I feel like that's sort of a nonviolent intersection with daily life, is to sort of process and do something as simple as pull the difference between knots, blobs, and lines or something like that as a simple, slow changing process, and existing in that background state is filled with confronting shame. That background state is filled with the openness of doubt. That background space is a space of wonder,
Can I ask you something, James? But the way you use rhythm, because one of the beauties of walking is it's this deeply rhythmic thing, finding your own rhythm, but also seeing how it intersects with other rhythms. And so in your work, there time and again, there is this rhythm and different rhythms in a one sees bouncing off. And so I'd just love to hear your reflections on the way you use rhythm.
I mean, I think when I think of a musicality to rhythm and think of like walking tempos or that real slow beat to play something at like 120, or to come from behind the beat, and like there is a visual record to playing an instrument, if you draft or if you work, and these images aren't that great, right? But if you can see, if you get to like a 0.3 lead or something, you're asking yourself to do something suitable to what the need of the hand is or something like that, right? And many of the things we've talked about today are like, what are processes that are, can scale up to, non-human operations for perceptible human needs or something like that, like making it to that scale. What this is sort of entering at that space of like a visual record of how you play an instrument maybe, and there's a rhythm to that. There's no going back, there's no eraser, right? It's like a record of, the record of wind for if you play an instrument, it's a record of passing. And that in that, as a stand-in for writing, hopefully, that it's capturing or chronicling time in just as sophisticated a way, right? It's still a type of conjectural analysis, right? It is still exacting of the present. And then,
We should open it.
Yeah.
Farzin has a question.
Hi. Hello. Thank you so much for this amazing panel. I have a really, maybe it was said right at the start when I was getting an espresso. My apologies, but I have like a simple question, because it seems like for both of you, in the context of some of the conversations we've been having today around different forms of automation and different forms of acceleration that comes from vast infrastructures that are mapping the planet and reacting to it in real time, that you're both kind of very slowly, deliberately turning your own bodies into instruments and actuators in some way. That for you, Garner, your body is the object of urban data collection, but it's not like small, it's like vast. That is like vast, incredible amounts of work that you're doing. And it kind of comes out in the final, this is both a model and a representation in some way, and you're challenging the model of the map by representing something that would fall outside of other forms of data acquisition that your body is only able to mediate and to capture. And James, for you, you're a different type of actuator where, the fact that your hand and your finger is doing that laborious work that looks familiar but not in terms of ways that we've come to read vector, rule-based artistic practices. So I'm kind of curious for you both as your anti-methods or your anti-automation in some way, like what is the value of the body in these systems that you're creating in some way? And I think that also in the work there is an authority that comes from the labor of your body that kind of comes through, and I read this very differently to other ways of creating this type of work.
And I think of the body in multiple respects, with walking, and also thinking about what is happening in automation. I think of it, with respect to measurement, and measurement in both space and time. So you think of, the scale, the ruler, the clock, and just, how does the body then, experience time? Where does the clock work in how I'm inhabiting space? Where am I slowing down? Where am I speeding up? How am I, absorbing, the rhythms, the sensibilities, the interactions, the urban form, what does that look like? Or for example, you saw one earlier, which was at night, how to then think of the night as, also in a different way of actually to think of architects in pen as interacting with time, where too often we really mean 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So what does it mean to think of the night as a rich way of interacting with time? How do we think of everything from infrastructure to transportation, to the way people inhabit space, to lingering, and a number of in a spatial but also social, in an economic in interactions, and so the body becomes a way of measuring that, how even the way I feel fear or feel disgust or speed up or slow down becomes in a deeply embodied way of thinking about time, or thinking about the weight of things, or thinking about and so that's what you're looking there is in Harlem. And again, it's again using time or thinking about it as a way to think strongly about time and to highlight different social relations there in Harlem. Whereas like there are the stars that everybody knows. Oh, Louis Armstrong, Thelonious Monk, Ralph Ellison, James Bowen. But then there's the stars, the people who are on the neighborhood when they die. Everybody in the block has a T-shirt with their face on it, and it has in a deep significance. If you want to actually understand that neighborhood or understand the block, you got to go. That's the guy who's been there, hanging there for the last 12 years. Or talk to Miss Matty. She's been looking out her brownstone for the last 40 years. She can tell you what was happening in the 70s. She can, in some ways, she becomes a way of measuring change in the neighborhood, which is something we're always interested in. And so that's mapping it, but also because it's also thinking about design. And I went through Harlem, and I went to every single block in Harlem, and I said, if Harlem is burning down, what 2 things will you take with you? And I sort of did in an informal survey, and almost every single person, people say, the Schomburg and something else, or see the Museum of Harlem and something else. What is something else? It's the #1 thing that everybody in Harlem said they would take. Almost everybody I asked hundreds. Can anybody guess what that one thing is? Anyone? The Apollo. And so what I did, so what you see there is that we then went back and got the data, and so we got the constellation of the night sky at the very minute that the Apollo opened. And so that's overlaid over the map there. So what you're looking there is a constellation of the very moment in which Harlem opened, that the night stars, along with the different stars that are there in Harlem. The star could be the musician everyone knows, or the star is Moshen, who is much beloved on the block and is like the brother of the block. And so it then tells you something quite revealing and important about the blocks, socially, culturally, but also that's again experienced or measured through the body, through time. So think of it as a tool of measurement, but also think the body as a way of mediation, in a number of other things. So yeah.
That's beautiful. I don't know what ties exactly into that. I mean, I think that a form of being present, right, in all of my work is a huge centerpiece. I think of a pool player, a pocket billiards player that I learned the game from, that hung on to this one book so specifically small, Willie Moscone on pocket billiards. He wrote inside, balls roll funny for everyone, James. And this is like a 65-year-old pool player that would move around and make all adjustments with his body, but you'd see him clean up Hollywood Billiards in San Francisco in the early 90s. And the most amazing thing about Joe, Big Joe, was the amount of amendments that he, this is a 6'4", 6'5" person that would have to like change posture and everything and account for being present to play the game, And I could imagine then, getting schooled constantly, like what the game would have been like at 30 or what the game would have been like at 25 with like, while I had this level of ability or level of reach or could lean over or crawl on something and reach something and didn't have the one integral part about a body or small muscle athletics, as Sennett talks about, and craftsmen, things like that. But like, the closer you adhere to a given structure or a set of mark making or whatever, like you have this like force and finality, flow and direction, line weight, gradient, every single strike, and it's building on itself. And then the body starts to respond to what it sees, and it can maybe control the pattern, right? So then all of a sudden you're dancing with it, and it's moving around with you, and you're watching it, right? And so if you play an instrument or something like that, there's a musicality to doing these two things at once. You're critiquing what you're hearing come out, and you're amending it while you're enjoying it. You know what I mean? So there's this complex relationship to the production of a physical object or a work or something like that that is happening, kind of all at once. And I think of that, like our art, this embodied, and there's so many words that just like you just want to bounce off the floor at the airport. Sustainability, or like, maybe today we want to take real-time nature and bounce it off the floor and see what's left, But like that, there seems to be something embodied about practice that becomes innate, or interfacing with an object, space, city, conversation, talking to people. Like, where does the interiority of others, things, or acts start to blur with you? And if we take that or scale that up to like, some of Haraway's challenges of, or like what these traps of like the difficulty potentially of like interspecies, multivalent forms of consciousness and stuff like that, right? I think it's a question of rehearsal and interiority and becoming part of that other structure, and the body, I don't know how to close that one.
As you said rehearsal, I think of also ritual. Walking is a ritual, and the kind of rituals around it. But also some of what I want is that automation. So it might seem that, this is just a counterpoint to everything that's happening. But there is something incredibly beautiful when the body sort of moves, it almost feels like an automata. It means that there's a certain level of comfort in which I'm sort of on automatic. And every time I catch that moment, I'm like, what is happening here? What is it about this space? What's the spatial environment that makes me able to get lost? Which is one of the beauties of walking. Like, where am I getting lost? Where am I no longer thinking? Where am I? Singing a Danny Brown song in my head, or maybe singing in a Dua Lipa, like where is like, I'm somewhere else, and where is that, automate? And so you almost want to feel like an automation, because at that point you said, let me stop right here and pull back and ask, what is it spatially, and socially that allows that comfort where, I can almost like be outside of my body and the body is moving as an automata.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. We need to let building services turn over the room for our keynote happening shortly. But any questions, I invite you to continue the conversation with us in the next few minutes as we sort of transition and turn over. But Donna, is it quick?
Really kind of a quick reaction about the thank you for your contribution and amazing conversation. I think I have so many thoughts, but just this notion of of embodiment through kind of a gestural practice, especially what John was talking about in relationship to the human body, and I just want to kind of ask whether that only exists in your framework without any kind of technological overlay, right? There's this kind of a pushback, which I think the critique of technology is a primary layer, right? Like the sort of and I think it appears in all through the conversation is the sort of uncovering the fallacy of the technological as a form of knowledge. But I'm wondering where is and Garrett, you talk about this kind of a human body as a form of automation, which actually it is kind of a proto-technological as a way of thinking about understanding spatiality. And so the kind of a level of instruments or that we use, and my way, kind of a technology is a cultural construct. Any kind of like pencil is much of a technology as it's sensor-based data. So, but just I want to kind of maybe insert that moment of resistance towards the kind of a fetishization of the binary in this context, as a form of knowledge and as a form of kind of the embodiment. And I just wanted to kind of I just had that like instant reaction and in both of your works, and I think it's something you said, John, that like just made me react.
I mean, I think that when you start, can I super quickly? I think when you start like building an emotional attachment to a project or a set of relationships or marks or something like that, it can, steam into like a personal territory that's not, I don't know, I don't think indicative of the broader conversation. There is not a resistance in my mind to a set of technologies, except like maybe this is presenting, and this is one little tiny facet of the work, this is presenting modes of practice, right? And there are many modes of practice or ways at coming at issues from certain modes of practice, and some practices are inherent to maybe being imbued with life ways or something like that. Like it sounds like you live a certain way and you engage space a certain way, right? But that's what I would just try, that's the only thing I would just try to like clean up. I don't think it, not meant to produce consternation.
Yeah, and I don't see it I think of it as this richly fluid interaction, and there are real dangers to focusing too much on the body, where it itself becomes an abstraction. So my concern is abstraction or the aggregate, which is as much as a danger with an individual walk-in as much as it is with a massive data set. And so it's to be alert, and it's this much richer and fluid and intersecting relationship between both, rather than in opposed to each other.